The campus of Bellevue University was known for its peaceful atmosphere and the promising futures of its students. Located on the outskirts of a small town, the university appeared to be a safe haven for those seeking higher education. But behind the ivy-covered buildings and pristine walkways, a darkness was brewing. It was just another typical semester when the first disappearance occurred. Sarah Mitchell, a sophomore psychology major, went missing after a late-night study session. Her friends assumed she was simply overwhelmed by finals. After all, stress can make people disappear into their studies. But as days turned into weeks, and no trace of Sarah was found, a quiet unease began to spread across campus. Among those who noticed the shift in mood was Alex Taylor, a senior psychology major, known for his charm and intellect. Alex was the perfect student, well-liked by professors and peers alike. He was the kind of person you'd never suspect. But that was before Sarah's disappearance. Weeks passed, and the search for Sarah Mitchell intensified. Posters with her face covered every bulletin board, and students anxiously whispered about her sudden vanishing. Rumors swirled about whether she had run away or met foul play. But there was one person who appeared to be oddly unshaken by the events: Alex. One evening, while Alex was walking with his roommate, Tom, near the library, Tom mentioned Sarah's disappearance in passing. Alex's response was cold. "Some people aren't meant to be found," he said, his voice flat, as if the concept of loss didn't affect him at all. Tom dismissed it, chalking it up to Alex's usual aloofness. But deep inside, a seed of suspicion began to take root. Meanwhile, Alex became more involved in the investigation, volunteering information to the police, offering theories, and constantly positioning himself as the helpful student. He even offered to assist with the search parties. What no one realized, however, was that Alex had a personal connection to Sarah. She had been a close friend of his, at least that's what he had led everyone to believe. Months passed, and the campus slowly returned to its daily routine, as though Sarah's disappearance was nothing more than a tragic anomaly. But then another student vanished. This time it was Mark Johnson, a quiet and introverted engineering major. Mark had been a friend of Alex's. They'd often worked on group projects together, and from the outside, their relationship seemed harmless. But Mark's disappearance sent shockwaves through campus. It was eerily similar to Sarah's case. No signs of struggle, no leads, just gone without a trace. Detective Laura Evans, the lead investigator on the case, couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to these disappearances. She knew there had to be a pattern, but finding it was proving difficult. That was until she began looking closer at Alex. His involvement in both cases, his intellectual demeanor, and his uncharacteristic indifference to the victims were all starting to raise alarms. As she dug deeper, a chilling thought began to form. What if Alex wasn't just a bystander? What if he was orchestrating the disappearances? The thought seemed impossible, but the pieces were starting to align in an unsettling way. Alex's charm was his weapon. He knew how to manipulate those around him, weaving a narrative that portrayed him as the grieving friend, the concerned student, the one who just wanted to understand what was happening to his classmates. He had been close to both Sarah and Mark. In fact, he had been the one to introduce them to each other. To the outside world, his presence was an asset to the investigation. But to Detective Evans, it felt like a carefully constructed facade. Every interaction he had with the police, every helpful suggestion, only made her more suspicious. It was as if he was leading them down the wrong path, keeping them just out of reach of the truth. But Evans couldn't quite pin it on him. Alex was smart, too smart. He'd thought of everything. Every alibi checked out. He had the perfect cover. As the investigation stalled, another student disappeared. This time it was Emily Carter, a sophomore art major, and Alex's former classmate. The pattern was becoming undeniable. All the victims had been close to Alex in some way. Some were his friends, others were students who had interacted with him in various academic settings. But Alex had grown bolder. He no longer made any attempt to hide his twisted joy. Emily's body was found weeks after her disappearance, hidden deep in the woods behind the campus. It was a grisly scene. Her body had been meticulously staged, almost as if Alex had turned her death into an art form. Detective Evans knew that the time had come to confront Alex, but she had no solid proof. All she had were instincts, and in this game, instincts could be deadly. The investigation reached a boiling point. Campus security, local police, and even the FBI had started to zero in on Alex. He had been so careful, so precise, but it was becoming increasingly clear that the walls were closing in. One night, Alex's facade finally cracked. It happened during a late-night interview with Detective Evans. She had brought him in under the pretense of asking about his alibi for the night Emily disappeared. But Evans had come prepared. She placed a series of photographs on the table in front of him. Photographs of the victims, each one with a cryptic note attached. Alex's eyes flickered, betraying him for the first time. He tried to maintain control, but the truth was too close now. The tension in the room grew thick, the weight of his crimes hanging over them like a suffocating fog. It was in that moment that Alex realized he was cornered. It wasn't a confession in the traditional sense. Alex didn't break down crying, didn't beg for forgiveness. Instead, he smiled. A cold, chilling smile that sent a shiver down Detective Evans' spine. "I didn't kill them," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I hunted them." The words hung in the air, as if Alex had finally allowed the full truth to escape. He wasn't just a killer, he was a predator. The victims weren't random. They were part of his twisted game. He had been stalking them, studying them like animals before striking. They were his prey, and he was the hunter. "I wanted to see how far I could push the boundaries of human behavior," Alex continued. "And they were perfect. The thrill of the hunt, the chase, that's what I lived for." Detective Evans felt a wave of disgust wash over her. But she had what she needed. Alex had finally slipped up. The truth was out, and justice was within reach. Alex was arrested that night. His calm demeanor never faltered as the handcuffs clicked around his wrists. He was led out of the interview room, still wearing that same unsettling smile, as though the entire thing had been a game to him from the start. The trial was swift. The evidence was overwhelming. Alex's obsession with his classmates, his methodical killings, and his chilling confession sealed his fate. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The campus, once filled with a sense of tranquility, was left shattered. The students who had survived his twisted game could never forget the face of the killer who had hunted them down. Someone they had trusted, someone who had been right next to them the entire time. As the years passed, Alex became a symbol of the darkness that can lurk within even the most ordinary people. His name became synonymous with terror, and the legend of the college killer who hunted his own classmates lived on as a haunting reminder that sometimes the greatest danger is the one hiding in plain sight. Though justice had been served, the scars left on Bellevue University would never fully heal. The survivors, the families of the victims, and the students who had once walked the same halls as Alex Taylor all carried the weight of what had happened. The quiet campus, once full of promise and hope, was now forever stained by the dark shadow of a killer who had hunted his own classmates. The story of Alex Taylor was one of twisted manipulation, psychological torment, and the horrific realization that sometimes the people closest to us are the ones we should fear the most. But in the end, justice had been served. Alex would never walk free again, and the campus could begin to heal. The victims would never be forgotten, and their stories would live on in the hearts of those who knew them. The lesson was clear: never trust appearances. Never believe that the person next to you is who they claim to be, because sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones you least expect. The arrest of Alex Taylor sent ripples throughout Bellevue University, but the aftershocks were far from over. As the trial date loomed, the university became a battleground of conflicting emotions. Survivors of Alex's reign of terror were left, grappling with a haunting question. How could they have been so blind? How had they never seen the darkness lurking behind his charming smile, his calculated intellect? Detective Evans found herself reflecting on those early days of the investigation. The small, almost insignificant details, things like Alex's casual attitude about the disappearances, the way he seemed almost too interested in the psychology of the victims, and his constant involvement in every aspect of the case. It had all pointed to something far more sinister than anyone had imagined. While Alex remained calm behind bars, his classmates and faculty members were left to rebuild their shattered lives, haunted by the knowledge that the person who had orchestrated their greatest fears had been sitting right in front of them all along. As the trial approached, Alex's obsession with his twisted acts only deepened. From within the walls of his cell, he would send letters to the media, carefully crafted messages that painted him as some sort of misunderstood genius. He reveled in the notoriety, in the fame that his crimes had brought him. Every piece of news about the trial seemed to fuel him further, feeding his delusions of grandeur. But it wasn't just his own self-importance that Alex sought. He yearned for one thing more than anything else: recognition. He wanted to prove that he was the smartest person in the room, the best predator, the one who could outsmart them all. The press, the public, and even his victims' families had become part of his game. He was the puppet master, pulling the strings from his prison cell, watching the world react to the horror he had unleashed. And in some twisted way, it gave him a sick sense of satisfaction. On the eve of the trial, Detective Evans uncovered something unsettling: a series of private journals kept by Alex during his time at Bellevue. She had been granted access to them as part of the investigation, but the contents were more chilling than she could have imagined. The journals were meticulous records of Alex's thoughts, his observations of his classmates, and his gradual descent into darkness. Each entry was more disturbing than the last, revealing a mind obsessed with control, power, and manipulation. It was clear that Alex had been grooming his victims long before he'd ever made the decision to kill them. He detailed every small interaction with his classmates, noting their weaknesses, their vulnerabilities. He had been studying them for months, learning their fears, their desires, their insecurities. And when the time came, he knew exactly how to strike. But what was most terrifying was the final entry, dated just days before his arrest. In it, Alex expressed a twisted sense of pride in what he had done. He didn't see his killings as crimes. He saw them as an art form. To him, each life was a canvas, and he was the artist, shaping the narrative of his victims' final moments with cold, calculating precision. While Alex's crimes were the center of attention, there was one aspect of the case that had been largely overlooked: the psychological toll on those who had survived his games. The survivors, those who had narrowly escaped his grasp, were living in a constant state of fear, paranoia, and guilt. They had been Alex's intended prey, and while they were fortunate enough to have escaped, the emotional scars ran deep. Take Jessica, for example, a quiet literature major who had shared several classes with Alex. She had always found him strange, but she had never suspected him of anything sinister. After all, he had been so helpful during the investigations, always willing to offer insights or lend a hand. But what Jessica hadn't realized was that she had been one of Alex's targets from the very beginning. In her mind, she had survived by sheer luck, but the truth was more complicated. Alex had deliberately allowed her to slip through his fingers, enjoying the chase, savoring the power he held over her without ever touching her. Jessica had been left shattered by the experience, and every time she closed her eyes, she saw Alex's calculating smile, the look of cold detachment in his eyes as he toyed with her like a predator with its prey. As the trial continued, Alex's defense team tried to paint him as a victim of circumstance, an individual who had been driven to madness by a troubled childhood and a series of unfortunate events. They argued that Alex wasn't truly responsible for his actions, that his killings were the result of a mental illness that he couldn't control. But Detective Evans knew better. She had spent months studying Alex's behavior, and she understood the truth. Alex wasn't insane, he was calculating. Every move he made was deliberate. He wasn't a victim of his circumstances. He was a predator who had honed his skills over years of careful observation. To Alex, his killings weren't an outburst of rage or a desperate cry for help. They were a cold, methodical pursuit of power and control. He wasn't trying to escape from his demons. He was using them as weapons against those around him. Evans began to wonder if Alex ever felt fear, if he had ever experienced the kind of terror his victims had felt. He had been so masterful in hiding his true nature that it was impossible to say. But one thing was clear. Alex had known exactly what he was doing every step of the way. As the trial neared its climax, there was one last piece of the puzzle that had yet to fall into place. The prosecution had already presented a mountain of evidence against Alex, but there was one final witness who could seal his fate: Tom, Alex's former roommate. Tom had been Alex's closest confidant, the one person who had seen him at his most vulnerable. And yet, Tom had never suspected him of being capable of such horror. But as the trial continued, the weight of his own conscience became unbearable. He had to speak the truth, even if it meant betraying the person he had once called a friend. Tom was terrified. He knew Alex better than anyone, and he knew that the man sitting in that courtroom was a monster. But Alex's manipulations ran deep. Tom had been a pawn in his game, a pawn who had no idea how much danger he had been in until it was too late. In a tear-filled testimony, Tom revealed the extent of Alex's psychological manipulation. He spoke of late-night conversations where Alex would discuss his twisted fantasies, his plans to kill, and how he believed he could get away with it all. Tom described how Alex had slowly twisted his mind, making him feel complicit in the crimes. In the end, Tom had been another victim, manipulated and controlled by the very person he had trusted the most. With Tom's testimony, the final threads of Alex's carefully constructed facade unraveled. The jury had heard enough to know that Alex was not just a cold-blooded killer. He was a master manipulator who had carefully chosen his victims, grooming them and toying with them like pieces on a chessboard. As the defense tried to paint him as mentally ill, the prosecution hammered home the point that Alex's actions were not the result of an illness but of a twisted desire for power. He had targeted those he saw as weak or vulnerable, and he had used his intelligence to exploit their fears, their hopes, and their dreams. The trial became more than just a search for justice. It became a battle of wits. Would Alex outsmart the system, or would the truth finally catch up with him? As the final arguments were made, and the jury prepared to deliberate, Detective Evans found herself grappling with one final question. How had Alex been able to keep his dark side hidden for so long? He was a master of manipulation, but there had to be something else. Something deeper that allowed him to prey on those around him. The answer, she realized, was simple. Alex had studied them. All of them. His classmates, his friends, his victims, they were all just characters in his twisted game. He knew how to exploit their weaknesses, how to make them trust him, and how to control them without them ever realizing it. But the most terrifying part of all was that Alex had never needed to lay a hand on anyone to make them feel his power. He had been the puppet master, pulling the strings from behind the scenes, and no one had even noticed. After weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated, and the world waited for the final verdict. Would Alex Taylor be found guilty of the heinous crimes he had committed? Would justice be served? As the judge read the verdict, the courtroom fell into a tense silence. Alex Taylor was found guilty of all charges. He would spend the rest of his life behind bars, never to walk free again. The families of the victims wept, knowing that while justice had been served, their lives would never be the same. The survivors, forever scarred by their experiences, could finally begin to heal. For Detective Evans, the case was over, but the memory of Alex Taylor's cold, calculating mind would stay with her forever. She knew that, in the end, Alex had gotten what he deserved. But there would always be a part of her that wondered how many others like him were out there, waiting to strike. In the years that followed, Bellevue University struggled to recover from the horrors that had unfolded within its walls. The campus, once filled with laughter and youthful energy, had become a place of quiet reflection, a reminder of the darkness that can hide beneath the surface. Alex Taylor's name would forever be associated with terror. His story became a cautionary tale, a warning to those who believed that the monsters in our lives are always easy to spot. In the end, it was the people closest to us who were the most dangerous. And as for Alex, his legacy was one of fear, manipulation, and a chilling reminder that sometimes the worst monsters are the ones who sit next to you in class. As Detective Evans sat alone in her office, reflecting on the case. A new report came in. Another college campus, another missing student. She couldn't help but wonder, had Alex truly been the only one? Or was there another predator out there, waiting for their moment to strike? The cycle of fear, it seemed, would never end. But at least, for now, Alex Taylor would never hurt anyone again. Even though Alex Taylor had been imprisoned, the chilling aftermath of his reign of terror still echoed through the halls of Bellevue University. The students and faculty members who had once filled the campus with laughter and light now walked with cautious glances, as if the shadow of Alex was still looming over them. Every creak of a floorboard, every flicker of a light, seemed to remind them of the fear that had once been real, and could, they feared, return at any moment. Survivors, such as Jessica and Tom, tried their best to resume normal lives, but nothing could ever truly bring back the sense of safety they once had. They found solace in each other's company, but the haunting memories remained, gnawing at their peace. Even Detective Evans found herself struggling with sleepless nights, plagued by images of Alex's cold, calculating smile. It wasn't just his crimes that haunted her. It was the question that lingered in the back of her mind. Was Alex the only one? She couldn't shake the feeling that something more sinister was still unfolding, a ripple effect of terror that extended far beyond Bellevue. Months after Alex's conviction, a chilling discovery was made. A student named Julia Martins, who had been missing for several weeks, was found dead, her body positioned in a similar fashion to the previous victims. The crime scene was eerily familiar, suggesting the possibility that there might be more than one killer at large. Detective Evans was immediately called to investigate. The sight of Julia's body stirred up a flood of memories from the original investigation, and the similarities were impossible to ignore. The way the body had been arranged, the meticulous details, Alex's signature was unmistakable. But there was a glaring difference. Alex was in prison. Could someone have been copying his methods, or worse, could there have been an accomplice all along? This new case reignited the question that had been haunting Evans for months. Could Alex have been part of a larger network of killers? Or was there another, even darker force lurking within the campus, one that had yet to be exposed? With the discovery of Julia Martin's body, suspicion fell on the campus once again. Students who had been friends with Alex, those who had once been in his inner circle, found themselves under intense scrutiny. But it wasn't just the former students. The investigation soon turned to someone more unexpected. Professor Henry Claremont, the psychology department chair. Professor Claremont had been a mentor to Alex, guiding him through his studies and encouraging his academic pursuits. But Evans had started to notice an unsettling pattern in his behavior. He had been present during many of the interviews, offering vague advice and sidestepping key questions. And, most troubling of all, there were whispers that Claremont had been unusually close to Alex, perhaps even indulging in his morbid fascination with the human psyche. Evans dug deeper into Claremont's past, discovering a series of cryptic notes in his personal files that seemed to echo Alex's disturbing obsession with the fragility of human life. Was Claremont complicit in Alex's crimes? Or was he simply another victim of Alex's manipulations? The more Evans delved into Professor Claremont's past, the more unsettling the connections became. She found out that Claremont had been involved in several controversial psychological experiments, all of which seemed to explore the boundaries of human morality and behavior. Many of these experiments had taken place under the radar, outside the university's ethical guidelines. In particular, there was one experiment that stood out, a study on the effects of fear and control, where participants were unknowingly put into terrifying situations. Evans suspected that Alex had been involved in this experiment, and that it might have sparked his violent urges. If Claremont had been encouraging Alex's darker tendencies, it would explain why Alex had been able to manipulate his classmates so effectively. The more Evans pieced together, the more she became convinced that Claremont's influence had gone beyond the academic realm. Was it possible that Claremont had been nurturing Alex's thirst for power and control, pushing him toward violence? The sinister connection between them seemed undeniable, but Evans needed more than just theory. She needed hard proof. The deeper Evans dug, the more chilling the truth became. It turned out that Professor Claremont had been part of a clandestine group of like-minded individuals, psychologists and professors who believed that true human nature could only be exposed through extreme fear and manipulation. Their twisted experiments pushed boundaries, forcing participants to confront their deepest, most primal fears, often to horrifying ends. Alex had been one of their star pupils, but Claremont's involvement in these experiments had gone beyond just observation. He had participated in them, encouraging students to push each other to their limits, testing how far they would go in the name of psychological discovery. The lines between academic curiosity and moral corruption had blurred. Evans realized that Alex's obsession with hunting his classmates might not have been purely his own idea. It could have been a product of the twisted games Claremont had introduced him to. This discovery left Evans feeling both disturbed and vindicated. She had finally found the missing piece of the puzzle, but it came with a terrifying realization. Alex was not acting alone. Claremont had been there all along, guiding him. Detective Evans finally confronted Professor Claremont in a tense, closed-door interview. The weight of the investigation had taken its toll on her, but she had a job to do, and she wasn't about to let Claremont slip away unnoticed. At first, Claremont denied any involvement in Alex's crimes, maintaining his academic persona of a respected professor and mentor. But Evans pressed him, exposing the connections between his experiments and Alex's killings. As the conversation progressed, Claremont's calm exterior began to crack, revealing a man who was far more sinister than anyone had ever imagined. "I didn't make Alex do anything," Claremont said coldly, his voice tinged with a chilling sense of pride. "He was always going to be this way. I merely showed him the possibilities." The truth hung in the air, and Evans knew in that moment that she had been right all along. Alex had been manipulated, yes, but Claremont had been the architect of his twisted worldview. Claremont had encouraged the very thing he had tried to deny: his involvement in the horrors that had transpired on campus. Professor Claremont's confession wasn't a full one. He never admitted to directly helping Alex carry out the murders, but he did confess to enabling him in every way. He had encouraged Alex to pursue his darkest urges under the guise of intellectual curiosity, had supported his disturbing theories, and had even provided him with resources to study human fear and control. In the end, Claremont's confession was enough to secure his arrest. He was charged with aiding and abetting murder, as well as countless violations of ethical research practices. But as the news of his arrest spread, many of the students and faculty members felt a strange sense of closure. While justice had been served, it felt as though there was still so much more to uncover. Claremont's trial became a media sensation, with many wondering how far his influence reached. Did he have other students, other victims, who had been silently affected by his twisted experiments? How many others had fallen prey to his dangerous manipulations? Even though Claremont was behind bars, the legacy of his experiments would never be fully erased. A group of former students came forward, describing the chilling psychological games Claremont had made them play. They spoke of manipulation, fear, and emotional torment, none of which had ever been addressed by the university. For many survivors, Claremont's arrest did little to ease their pain. They were left to rebuild their lives, haunted by the psychological scars Claremont had left on them. And for some, the fear still lingered, as though the specter of Alex Taylor and Professor Claremont would never truly leave them. Years later, Bellevue University still carried the dark legacy of the murders. The campus had never truly recovered from the horrors that Alex Taylor and Professor Claremont had inflicted upon it. Detective Evans, now a retired investigator, attended the memorial for the victims, each name etched in stone as a reminder of the lives lost. As she stood there, she couldn't help but think about how easily evil could hide behind a mask of normalcy. Alex Taylor had been the perfect student, and Professor Claremont had been the trusted mentor. Yet both had been responsible for unimaginable horrors. In the end, the true evil was not just in the murders, but in the manipulation of minds, the twisting of human nature for personal gain. Alex Taylor may have been the one to carry out the killings, but it was Claremont's perverse ideology that had shaped him. The memorial was a somber reminder that justice had been served, but only after too many lives had been shattered. The haunting memory of the Bellevue University killings would remain forever etched in the minds of the community. While Alex Taylor and Professor Claremont had paid the price for their crimes, the true cost of their actions was something that could never be quantified. For Detective Evans, there was no satisfaction in solving the case. There was no relief in bringing the killers to justice. The scars left behind on the campus, in the lives of the victims' families, and within the survivors' hearts were permanent. And as she walked away from the memorial, she couldn't shake the thought, how many more like them are out there? How many more will hide their darkness behind a mask of charm and intellect? In the end, justice had been served, but the price of it had been far too high. The aftermath of Alex Taylor's reign of terror had sent shockwaves through Bellevue University, but life seemed to continue, as life always does. However, there were still whispers, the kind that kept survivors awake at night. The university had tried to move forward, but the scars left by the killings were not easily erased. What the public didn't know was that there were still lingering questions that hadn't been fully answered. A final student had been ignored in the investigation, Nathaniel Monroe. He was a quiet, introverted computer science student, always in the background, a part of Alex's extended social circle but never directly involved with him. No one thought much of him during the investigation, but Evans began to wonder if she had missed something. Nathaniel had left campus abruptly the day before Alex's arrest, and no one had heard from him since. Her instincts told her something was wrong. Evans turned to the most unlikely source, Nathaniel's digital footprint. As she combed through his online activity, a chilling pattern emerged. Nathaniel had been obsessed with studying criminal psychology long before Alex's crimes came to light. His research had delved into topics similar to those Alex had explored: the darkness of the human mind, the psychology of killers, and, most disturbingly, the way fear and power could be used to manipulate others. But Nathaniel hadn't just been reading about these topics. He had been quietly interacting with Alex. Their conversations, hidden within encrypted messages, painted a disturbing picture. Alex's manipulation tactics weren't confined to his immediate victims. He had been recruiting followers, even online, and Nathaniel appeared to have been one of them. The deeper Evans dug, the more she realized that Nathaniel hadn't just been a passive bystander. He had been an active participant in Alex's twisted worldview. As Evans uncovered more, the truth became inescapable. Nathaniel Monroe wasn't just an innocent student who had been swept up in the chaos of Alex's reign. He was a disciple, a student of Alex's manipulations. Nathaniel had admired Alex from afar, studying his every move, learning his methods. Their relationship, hidden behind the veil of academic discourse, was far darker than anyone had realized. Nathaniel had seen Alex as a figure to emulate, a mentor who had mastered the art of control and fear. Evans found chilling evidence in Nathaniel's computer, a detailed journal documenting his admiration for Alex's ability to orchestrate fear and manipulation. It wasn't just a passive interest, it was a full-on obsession. Nathaniel had been preparing himself for something more sinister. He had been studying Alex's every move in order to one day replace him, to take his place as the next predator. Evans's heart raced as she pieced together the puzzle. Nathaniel Monroe hadn't just been a follower. He had been planning to continue Alex's legacy. With Alex behind bars, Nathaniel had become emboldened, convinced that he could carry on his mentor's work. It became clear Nathaniel had been quietly orchestrating a series of smaller, unnoticed attacks, killings that had gone undetected until now. The pattern was unmistakable. The victims were students who had crossed paths with Alex, who had been close to the truth about his actions. They were, in a sense, Nathaniel's final test, a way to prove that he had inherited Alex's twisted genius. The idea that Alex's influence could extend beyond the grave, that another mind could take up his mantle, was a terrifying thought. But Evans couldn't ignore the evidence. Nathaniel was more than just a student. He was a predator, carefully biding his time to strike again. Detective Evans went to the police with her findings, but Nathaniel had already vanished. It seemed as though the young man had been planning his escape for months, slowly distancing himself from the university and erasing his tracks. He was a ghost, a phantom who moved in silence, always one step ahead of those who hunted him. The case was far from closed. Nathaniel had become a new kind of threat. Someone who knew how to stay hidden, how to manipulate the system, and how to avoid detection. As Evans and her team followed every lead, the growing sense of dread was palpable. It felt as though the dark force Alex Taylor had unleashed was still very much alive, coursing through the campus in Nathaniel's calculated silence. Evans couldn't help but wonder, was Nathaniel just another victim of Alex's influence, or was he a different kind of monster altogether? A monster that had learned from the master and now wanted to surpass him. Weeks turned into months, and Evans felt the weight of her failure pressing down on her. Nathaniel remained elusive, leaving behind a trail of fear but no concrete evidence. His obsession with Alex had gone too far, and Evans couldn't help but feel personally responsible. She had been so focused on solving Alex's case, on finding the mastermind behind the killings, that she had ignored the possibility of another predator rising in his wake. As the clock ticked, Evans redoubled her efforts. She enlisted the help of former colleagues, scouring Nathaniel's digital trail and reaching out to his family, his old friends, anyone who might have a clue to his whereabouts. Every lead seemed to hit a dead end, though. Nathaniel had vanished, taking his dark ambitions with him. Just when Evans had begun to lose hope, a breakthrough came. One of Nathaniel's former classmates came forward with a strange story. This student, a shy and quiet art major named Emily, had been one of the last people to see Nathaniel before he disappeared. She described how Nathaniel had grown more erratic in the weeks leading up to his disappearance. But there was one conversation that stood out. He said he was going to finish what Alex started, Emily recalled, her voice trembling. He said the world wasn't ready for the kind of power Alex had, but he would be. The words chilled Evans to the core. Nathaniel wasn't just trying to mimic Alex. He had bigger plans. He wanted to perfect the methodology, to push it further, to truly understand what made a killer tick. The psychological experiments, the twisted games. Nathaniel was trying to become more than just a student of violence. He wanted to create something far worse. The revelation that Nathaniel was actively seeking to outdo Alex Taylor made Evans's blood run cold. She wasn't just hunting a copycat killer. She was hunting a person who sought to redefine terror itself. Finally, after months of searching, a tip led Evans to an abandoned building on the outskirts of the city. There, in the eerie silence of the night, she found Nathaniel Monroe. He was standing in the center of a room, surrounded by old photographs, detailed maps of Bellevue University, and psychological profiles of his former classmates, Alex's victims. Nathaniel stood motionless, staring at a map with a cold, empty expression. He turned slowly as Evans entered the room, his eyes locking onto hers with the same chilling intensity that had once marked Alex. "You finally found me?" Nathaniel said, his voice calm but filled with a twisted satisfaction. "I knew it would only be a matter of time." Evans took a step forward, her heart pounding. "You don't have to do this. This isn't who you are." Nathaniel smiled, his face contorting with an eerie joy. "This is who I am. Alex was my mentor. He taught me everything. And now I'm ready to finish what he started. You should understand, this is who we are. We're born to be predators." Evans knew the confrontation would end in one of two ways, with Nathaniel's capture or with him vanishing into the night, continuing the legacy he had inherited. It was the final game, the end of an era that had begun with Alex Taylor. Evans had a choice to make: capture Nathaniel and risk him disappearing once again, or end this cycle of terror once and for all. As she closed in on him, Nathaniel made his move. He darted toward an exit, but Evans was faster. With a sharp, practiced motion, she tackled him to the ground, subduing him with swift precision. Nathaniel struggled beneath her, but his resistance was weak. The fight was over. "Your mentor is gone, Nathaniel. It's over," Evans whispered, pressing him to the ground as the police arrived. Nathaniel's laughter, low and hollow, echoed in the darkness. "You'll never stop it. There are always more like us." As the authorities placed him in handcuffs, Evans couldn't shake the thought that he was right. The world was full of hidden darkness, of minds twisted by their own demons. But for now, the nightmare was over. Nathaniel Monroe was convicted and sentenced to life in prison, but the truth remained. There would always be more like him. Bellevue University was forever scarred by the events that had transpired, and though the case was closed, Evans couldn't help but wonder how many other predators were out there, waiting for their moment to strike. As she walked away from the courthouse, the weight of the case lingered. She had found justice for Alex's victims and for Nathaniel's, but at what cost? The legacy of terror they left behind would never be fully erased. Yet, as Evans looked out at the world around her, she understood that sometimes justice wasn't just about punishment. It was about survival. And for now, the world was still spinning despite everything. The silence that followed was the final answer. As Nathaniel Monroe sat behind bars, Detective Evans thought the case was finally behind her. But there was a lingering doubt in her mind, something she couldn't quite shake. Despite his arrest, the case felt unfinished, and her instincts told her there was something more, something hidden in the depths of the investigation. She began to review the case files once more, looking for something she had missed in the frantic days leading up to Nathaniel's capture. As she pored over the evidence, she stumbled upon a strange detail: an anonymous phone call made to the police on the night of one of Nathaniel's earlier killings. The call had been made from a payphone near the university campus, but there was no record of it in the case reports. It was as if someone had deliberately erased it. Evans tracked down the call's origin and discovered something chilling. The call had been placed by a student named Jessica Harper, a name she recognized. Jessica had been one of the survivors from Alex Taylor's reign of terror, but she had disappeared after the trial, her whereabouts unknown. Had she been in contact with Nathaniel, or worse, was she somehow involved? Evans managed to track Jessica Harper down to a small, run-down apartment on the outskirts of town. The once bright-eyed survivor now looked gaunt, her eyes hollow with a sense of defeat that only trauma could instill. When Evans confronted her, Jessica's hands trembled, but she didn't try to hide. "I knew you'd come eventually," Jessica said quietly, her voice almost a whisper. "I didn't want to get involved, but you need to understand. Nathaniel wasn't just another student. He was a part of something far bigger." Jessica revealed that after Alex's arrest, she had been haunted by nightmares of him. But in those nightmares, Alex's face morphed into Nathaniel's. She had become obsessed, convinced that the darkness Alex had unleashed was not confined to just him. It was Nathaniel who had found her, drawn to her fear. He had reached out, offering her a place in his plan, a plan to resurrect Alex's legacy in a far more terrifying form. He wanted her to help him, but Jessica had refused, and in her refusal, she had become his target. The more she resisted, the more dangerous Nathaniel had become, until she had to run. "I couldn't stop him. I thought it was all over," Jessica whispered, the weight of her guilt pressing down on her. "But I should have known better. Evil doesn't die." With Jessica's new revelation, Evans was plunged back into the heart of the mystery. She had thought the worst was over, but now she realized Nathaniel's influence had stretched far beyond what she had imagined. He wasn't just a copycat killer. He was a force, a symbol of everything Alex had ever stood for, and that symbol was growing stronger. Evans revisited the psychological profiles she had gathered on both Alex and Nathaniel. The more she looked at their twisted minds, the more she realized that Nathaniel had always seen himself as the successor to Alex, the one who would perfect his mentor's methods. But it wasn't just the killings that Nathaniel was obsessed with, it was the power that came with manipulating people, with playing God. Evans reached out to the head of the psychology department at Bellevue University, Professor Claire Devlin, who had worked with Nathaniel on several research projects. When Evans asked her about Nathaniel's mindset, Professor Devlin hesitated before speaking. "He wasn't just obsessed with the psychology of fear," Devlin said quietly. "He was obsessed with the idea of control over others, over his own destiny. And I'm afraid that his obsession may have been rooted in something far darker than we could have realized. He was fascinated with the idea of creating the perfect predator, someone who could not just kill but manipulate and break the human psyche." A chilling realization dawned on Evans. Nathaniel's plans had gone far beyond what anyone had suspected. He was creating something more dangerous than just another killer, He was creating a predator who could control others, who could lead them into darkness without ever needing to lay a hand on them. Evans's heart sank as she pieced together the full scope of Nathaniel's plan. He wasn't just a killer, he had become something worse. Nathaniel had been recruiting people, targeting vulnerable individuals who had been manipulated into becoming part of his deadly scheme. It was a network, a dark web of influence that stretched far beyond Bellevue University. But there was more, much more. Evans discovered that Nathaniel had been in contact with a shadowy figure, a former professor, someone with ties to Alex's past, who had helped foster the dangerous ideology that both Alex and Nathaniel had shared. This professor, whose name was never mentioned in the public trial, had been pulling strings behind the scenes, ensuring that Nathaniel's twisted vision could continue without being detected. Evans knew that this had to end, and it had to end now. If Nathaniel's influence continued to grow, more innocent lives would be lost. She had to find the professor before Nathaniel did. Evans tracked the professor, whose name turned out to be Dr. Thomas Renwick, to an isolated cabin in the woods. He had been living off the radar, hiding from the authorities, but he had never stopped working behind the scenes. Evans knew this would be the final confrontation, the end of a dangerous cycle that had started with Alex and had now consumed Nathaniel. The moment she stepped inside the cabin, Evans was hit with a wave of suffocating darkness. Dr. Renwick was sitting calmly at a desk, as if he had been expecting her. "You think you've won?" Renwick sneered, his voice dripping with arrogance. "Nathaniel is the future. He is the culmination of everything Alex Taylor started. You think you've stopped him, but you've only delayed the inevitable." Stay tuned for more chilling cases on Cold Case Chronicles, where the truth is always darker than fiction.